Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Inept General, and welcome to my Skaven magic video. Now, guys, for those of you who are maybe new to my channel, or this is maybe your first video, this is a follow-up to my Skaven army list video, which looks at the potential units and generals and heroes that might appear in the Skaven army in Total War Warhammer 2. If you haven't seen that already, do check the top right hand corner now, or find the link in the description below after this video. But because the Skaven use very different magic from the races we've had in Total War Warhammer 1, and different magic from the races that we will have in Total War Warhammer 2, I thought it was maybe worth doing a special video on the magic of Skaven and how that might play out in Total War Warhammer 2, and what we might expect from some of their laws of magic. So the Skaven themselves believe that their magic is drawn from the Great Horned One himself, their god, their creator, really the sole focus of all Skaven worship. So they think that all magic flows directly from the Horned Rat. And to some extent, this may very well be true, as there's an element of belief enforcing reality when it comes to the realm of chaos and the gods in the Warhammer world. But really, when it comes down to the very essence of it, they draw their magic from the chaos sources at either pole, much like everyone else, and the winds that bring it down and spread it around the world. They're still kind of tapping into the winds of magic. But much like the forces of chaos or even the dark arts of necromancy, they're said to be tapping in to a magical force known as dark magic or Dahar. And indeed, some Skaven have been known to delve into necromancy and chaos magics, but it's thought they're met with swift retribution from the Horned Rat himself, and many just simply disintegrate at some point, having used too much of these different kinds of magic and not their own Skaven laws of magic. Now, Skaven magic over the years in Games Workshop games has changed a little bit from game to game. In the role-playing game, there are, I think, several laws of magic known as warp magic, stealth magic, and plague magic. I think in Mordheim, unless I'm mistaken, and do tell me if I'm wrong, I never played much of Mordheim back in the day, but I think in Mordheim all you had was Eshen sorcerers who did just stealth magic, or a variation of what is known as stealth magic in the Warhammer role-playing game. However, when it comes to the tabletop I think has either been just categorized as Skaven magic, or in more recent traditions, been separated out into two laws of magic known as the Law of Ruin and the Law of Plague. Now, different characters and heroes within the Skaven army can use these different laws, and I do discuss that a bit in my army video, but effectively the Law of Plague is used by the Plague Priests of Clan Pestilence. The Grey Seers and the Vermin Lord of the Skaven armies can also use this law of magic. Now, Plague magic itself was developed by Clan Pestilence in its isolation in the jungle forests of Lustria and later on in the Southlands as well. So that's where they've been practicing kind of by themselves, developing this lore of magic, which they've sort of singularly mastered and written into a book known as the Liber Bubonicus, which they use to sort of note down their spells and keep track of them. So that's where plague magic developed out of this singular clan. Now, Grey Seers have managed to learn this lore of magic and now often use it as well as the Vermin Lords. Now, on the tabletop, you'd roll a dice and add it to certain wizard levels, and that would decide whether you managed to get your magic spell off, and the opponent would get a chance to dispel it if they wanted to by rolling some dispel dice. However, in Warhammer, Total War Warhammer, we know that there's no dispel dice, and magic is cast based on a Winds of Magic value. So I'm going to tell you guys a dice roll value, but the direct translation might not go over to Total War Warhammer in terms of a corresponding Winds of Magic value, but it'll give you an idea of sort of the costs of each of these spells and how they might stack up, if nothing else, in comparison to one another when we see the Skaven laws of magic introduced in Total War Warhammer 2. So the cheapest of these spells for the Plague Law is a spell known as Pestilent Breath. Now that was cast on a 5+ value. Now, the pestilent breath is summoned from the plague monks themselves, uttering horrible incantations, and in one foul, enormous belch, they let forth a cloud of pestilence pestilent, disease-ridden breath, just in a... and that strikes down enemies in an arc in front of them. Now, we've seen these before in Total War Warhammer with the Curse of the Midnight Wind, I think it is, for the Law of Heavens. I imagine it will probably work out very similarly with the little triangular icon pointing out, and the attack will go in that direction. So we've seen very similar stuff before in the game, and it will probably take on that form. The next spell we have on the list is known as Blessed with Filth. That is cast on a 7-up. Now, what happens here is the sorcerer conjures forward a horribly putrid mist that ensnares a friendly unit, and starts to condensate on all the weapons of this friendly unit, giving them poison damage, but it's more virulent poison damage than standardized poison damage, so maybe like a slightly upgraded version of poison damage for any unit that has this cast on them, is how the Blessed with Filth spell might work in Total War Warhammer 2. The next spell up is the Withering, and this is when a mage selects an enemy unit, he focuses his energies, and they themselves start to wither away. Their muscle mass starts to depreciate. They start to appearingly shrink and become much weaker versions of the men, elves, or dwarves that they once were. And then they are far easier to strike down from your Skaven allies. Now, what this did on the tabletop was it took away a toughness value, which would decide what hits would effectively wound you. Now, in Total War Warhammer, it doesn't work the same way. So this would either be a debuff of melee defense, or a debuff of armor, or perhaps even a debuff of both. But effectively make you a more vulnerable unit to attack. That's how the Withering should work in Total War Warhammer 2. Next up, we have Vermintide. Now, Vermintide's a bit of a weird one because rats themselves are a unit in the Skaven army. But the idea of Vermintide is that rats often, just normal rats, everyday rats that you and I know, often go along with Skaven armies. They are often just found at the feet of their fellow, much larger brethren, and they seem drawn by some unknown force to join in any warband of Skaven that happens to be on the march. So the idea is that the wizard manages to guide them or direct them, and they go and attack any target the wizard picks out. So the sorcerer focuses them and directs them, and they go off and attack whatever he has pointed them in the direction of. Now, on the tabletop, this goes in a straight line, this attack, for a sort of slightly randomized distance. So it could be a wave attack, like we've seen, like Winds of Death for the vampire count, or it could take the form of a vortex attack. So on the battlefield, I don't think you'll see rats properly modeled. I think we'll probably see something slightly abstract, much like the Amber Wizard's Flock of Doom, where we'll see them kind of maybe scurrying around on the ground around the unit, and that will be causing them damage. But it'll be amazing to see if they make a wave of rats just swarming over regiments or just like passing through them. That might make quite the spectacle. But that is the Vermintide. Now, our next spell is Cloud of Corruption. Now, this is cast on an 11 plus on the tabletop, so twice as much as the first spell we discussed. Now, this is when the spellcaster summons forth just a stinking cloud of disease. Now, because this is just disease and it's kind of cast all around the spellcaster, it's almost summoned forth from around him, from the air, from maybe him himself, and it does damage to everything around him. So it will do damage to friendly units, it will do damage to the enemy units as well. Now, on the tabletop, it would have more chance of doing damage to the enemy units, but it could still hurt your own units. So I wonder if they actually implement this in Total War Warhammer 2, whereby you can have the Plague Priest set off this spell, but you better make sure there's none of your friendly units around him when he does, or at least if they are, they're units you don't mind getting hurt. Maybe like the Skaven slaves, something along those lines. So that is the Cloud of Corruption. It just hurts everything around it. Now, the final spell, cast on a 13 plus in the Plague spells for the Skaven, is just called Plague. The idea is that one of the Plague Priests or Graciers or the Vermin Lord has selected a spell from the Book of Woe. Now, I cover the Book of Woe in the army list, but the Book of Woe is a big book kept by Clan Pestilence, and Clan Pestilence's main aim is to develop a disease that will wipe out all the kind of surface dwellers and the dwarves as well, just so that Skaven can take over the whole world in one foul swoop. So they dedicate themselves to making and breeding and infecting people and Skaven and anything they can find for their experiments to create this horrific disease. And everyone they create, they write down in the Book of Woe. So the idea is that one of these sorcerers looks at the Book of Woe, picks out a disease, unleashes it upon a unit, and that does direct damage on a unit. Now, where Plague gets a bit weird on the tabletop is that Plague can be transferred. So if you roll well, and you say I'm playing as Empire, and someone casts Plague against me, when it comes to, I think, my turn or their turn, I can't remember exactly, but I get a chance to roll a dice. Now, on the right roll, I can either choose to end the spell, so it just stops working on everybody, or I can flip it over to one of the Skaven units, and it will do damage to them. Likewise, when his unit's suffering from it, my opponent can roll, and he might pass it back onto me, or he might choose to end the spell. Alternatively, it might just stay affecting a unit for a long time, or the caster can choose to flip the spell onto just another unit in his enemy's army. So it's a weird one because it has this element of moving about. Now, that could be an interesting mechanic whereby if you cast Plague on a unit, the way it might work in Total War Warhammer 2 is if that unit comes too close to another unit, they start to suffer from Plague as well. Maybe on a decreased level. Maybe that's how they might even it out from a balancing perspective in Total War Warhammer. And then if that unit is near another unit, then they might suffer from Plague as well. So if you cast Plague on a clump of enemy units, like say as they were approaching your army, not necessarily fighting your guys, then that could be potentially devastating and would be a really interesting spell to see implemented in Total War Warhammer 2. Otherwise, they might go the simplest route, which is just making it a direct damage spell, but that's a bit boring. I like the idea that you can pass on Plague from one unit to the other, and it's just a bit random. And then you want to make sure that that spell runs out. You have to kind of time it right. That runs out before any of the enemy army gets to you. Otherwise, your units will start to suffer from Plague. So not one to be cast in combat unless you don't care who that unit's fighting, is again, much like the Skaven slaves. But I think that would add a really interesting mechanic to this spell. That kind of sums up the spells of Plague. Now, moving on to the spells of Ruin. Now, the spells of Ruin can be cast not by the Plague Priest, but by the Warlock Engineers. And, of course, the Grey Seers and the Vermin Lords as well. They both have access to this lore of magic. Let's go through some of the way that it's not necessarily a full lore, but for the sake of simplicity, let's just call it the lore of Ruin. Let's start with the first spell on the list, and that is Skitterleap. Now, Skitterleap is just a straight up Nightcrawler style teleport. Now, it allows the caster, they can teleport themselves, or they can teleport characters, infantry characters. I think it's what it's limited to. So that would make a very interesting mechanic where you just teleport your general sort of to the rear of an enemy or somewhere else on the battlefield, or teleport your spellcaster. That would be a very cool little mechanic to be able to do. Or to teleport them straight into combat, or to teleport them right to where the enemy lord is, or to where, teleporting a heavy melee focus lord straight next to their main spellcaster would be a great little bit of Skitterleap. So that's Skitterleap, and yeah, I think the Nightcrawler analogy is fairly good because they straight up write BAMF in the description, which for those of you who aren't necessarily X-Men fans, is the noise associated with Nightcrawlers teleporting. So the next spell, and that's cast on a 5+, so a fairly cheap spell to use on the tabletop at least, but I think it would have more strategic importance perhaps in Total War Warhammer, so Creative Assembly might make it one of the more expensive ones, but we'll have to wait and see. The next spell up is Warp Lightning. Now on this one, the Warlock Engineer would simply raise his fleshy paws, point at the unit he wanted to strike, and lightning of a greenish black hue would spew straight line a furious attack straight at an enemy unit. Now this, of course, if you hadn't guessed, is a magic missile attack and will play like a magic missile in Total War Warhammer 2, depending on line of sight, and it will probably hit off any unit in its direct line of fire, rather than necessarily guaranteeing hitting the unit you're aiming at, if there's units in front of it or anything like that. But that's how Warp Lightning will work. Potentially a very devastating missile attack, and that is cast on a 6-up, so just slightly more expensive than Skittily. So next up we have Howling Warp Gale. Now this is an interesting one, more perhaps on the tabletop than I know what Creative Assembly might do with it, but the idea is that the sorcerer points towards the heavens and summons just these massive galing winds of kind of warp energy. Now these winds cause all flying creatures, they just can't maintain themselves in winds that strong, so on the tabletop they'd be forced to land, allowing ground units to charge them and the like. Now, because there's no toggle flight mode in Total War Warhammer 2, it doesn't look like. At least I've had flying units in what I got to play with Creative Assembly, and there doesn't seem to be any sight nor sound of toggled flying mode. So that doesn't look like that rule will be able to be transferable. But it also does damage to, not damage to, but it's a detriment to missile units. Not the Skaven missiles, however. They're still as accurate as ever because the sorcerer can kind of help guide them through the winds. But enemy missiles take a -1 chance to hit, so just making them slightly less good. Now, I think this might end up being like a single targeted unit spell rather than something that applies across the whole battlefield, but bringing down the accuracy, which is a hidden stat in Total War Warhammer, but bringing down the accuracy of enemy missiles. Now that was a map-wide effect. That would be something very interesting in terms of what it was able to do. But I see them doing it probably more as a singular targeted thing. You're maybe taking away missile damage or something like that, if not accuracy itself in terms of the stats they display in Total War Warhammer. But it will probably be something that adversely affects enemy missiles if they bring it into Total War Warhammer. And that is cast on a 7+. Now, the next one is something known as Death Frenzy. Now, the idea here is that the sorcerer starts wildly gesticulating and he begins to kind of affect the minds of the Skaven he cast his spell on, and they begin to start frothing and almost go into a kind of rabid rage where they just charge at enemies. Now, this acts on the tabletop like Frenzy, but a better Frenzy. So Frenzy on the tabletop would allow you to add 1 to the attacks you make on a unit that is frenzied, but this would allow you to add 2. Now the effects didn't stack in terms of you being able to have several extra attacks for any unit. You just go to the 2 mode rather than the 1 mode, but I imagine it being a better Frenzy in Total War Warhammer 2 and just allowing your units to do extra damage for a period of time. Maybe also, increasing their melee attacks stat and maybe even their weapon strength. Now, the downside of this Death Frenzy spell is that while you have it, you're also taking damage yourself. So I think in Total War Warhammer 2, it should do the unit you cast this on damage as well, if they're going to be true to the spell on the table lore. So that's an interesting kind of toss-up for you as a player to decide, am I happy with this unit taking some damage as long as it deals out sort of a lot more damage than it does normally? And is that trade worth taking? So yeah, an interesting tactical option for you there with Death Frenzy. Now, Death Frenzy casts on a 9 or more value. Next up, we have Scorch, which casts on a 10 or more value. So Scorch, the wizard, sort of prepares himself and just dives his hands, digs them deep into the dirt at his feet. And then somewhere on the battlefield, an enormous plume of fire erupts out from the ground, doing flaming damage to anyone hit by it. On the tabletop, this didn't move around like a lot of the other Vortex spells. I believe it just stayed in one place, and it's kind of just acted as like a one-hit go. But this could be a Vortex spell much in the same way the Pit of Shades is for the Lore of Shadow, where it just stays in one place but does consistent damage. Now, this spell would also have a morale morale effect where it would cause the unit who was hit by it to take panic tests if it wounded any of the singular units within it. So I imagine it doing flaming damage to you, but also loss of leadership at the same time, which might cause your guys to break easier than just a normal flaming attack vortex spell. So that's how Scorch works, just potentially a devastating spell to things that are susceptible to flame, as well as being able to perhaps break any unit that it hits. Next up, we have Crack's Call. Now this is the most expensive spell to cast in the Lore of Ruin. Now the idea here is that the wizard starts doing incantations and he's storing up energy and he raises his foot high in the air and brings it slamming down on the ground, at which point this massive crater starts to form and rush forward in the direction that the wizard's chosen it to travel, enveloping and swallowing into the earth any units caught in its path. Now this is a potentially devastating spell on the tabletop, and it can also do damage to buildings. Now I mentioned this one slightly in my Skaven army video, in that this spell could potentially damage walls in sieges. Now, we have been told by Creative Assembly that the High Elves have a spell called Vol's Hammer that actually acts as a spell that's able to destroy walls in siege battles. So if the High Elves have one, there's no reason this spell for the Skaven, which in the tabletop rules says it destroys buildings and even segments of large structures like walls, that this spell wouldn't potentially be able to do that as well. So it'd be great to see this spell being used in a potential siege, but I imagine it will prove very expensive if that's the kind of power they're putting behind it in Creative Assembly. But can't wait to see what Crack's Call looks like once their animators have got their hands on it. And that is the Lore of Ruin. As I've said throughout, the Warlock Engineers can use the Ruin, and the Plague Priests can use Plague, but these two units can use both. The Vermin Lord on the left and the Grey Seer on his Screaming Bell on the right, they have the option of using either the Lore of Ruin or the Lore of Plague, because these guys are the most powerful magic users that the Skaven have to offer. Now, because these are the most powerful magic users the Skaven have to offer, they have access to a secret, different spell known as the dreaded 13th spell. Now, what this spell does is the Vermin Lord or the Grey Seer, whoever's casting it, starts to tear apart the fabric of reality to a certain extent with the magic they use. And in warping reality, they cause the unit they cast this spell on to suddenly start to mutate and change and sort of writhe around in agony, their flesh taking on hair, their bodies shrinking or curling over, their teeth growing sharp and long. And effectively what this spell does is it causes the unit it's cast upon to be changed into clan rats, to become Skaven themselves. Now, we've seen this happen in Total War Warhammer 1. Now, I imagine this will work very much like Morgor's spell, where if your unit is under 50% health, he can, or 25%, I can't remember exactly, he can change it into a unit of Chaos Spawn. Now, whether the clan rats that are summoned by the dreaded 13th spell have the same problem that summoned units have, whereby their health will depreciate over time, we don't know that yet. They may just be playable unit like a normal unit of clan rats. If they were being true to the tabletop, that's how they would work. But we never know. Creative Assembly could go either way on that one. But we've seen a similar mechanic play out in the game before, so there's no reason to rule out that they will incorporate the dreaded 13th spell into the lore of Skaven. And so, with the power of this final spell, that about brings us to the end. Now, just bear in mind with some of the values I've given you before, the dreaded 13th spell casts on a 25+. So by far the most expensive spell in the repertoire of the Skaven sorcerers. But that's the Skaven lore for you guys. Hope you enjoyed that brief little overview. And I hope you didn't mind me sort of breaking out the magic of the Skaven into its own little video, rather than have it necessarily incorporated in the Skaven army video. But as always, guys, a huge thank you all for watching. Do drop a like, do subscribe for more Total War Warhammer 2 content, and do check out some of the playlists on my channel if you're interested in some more army lists or lore of the Warhammer universe. And as usual, guys, thank you all for watching. Special thank you to my patrons, John, Reese, Colin, Mateus, Samuel, Matthews, David, and Peter. And a special thanks to you all, of course, as well. I hope to catch you all on the next one. Bye, guys.